Melody.
Yeah.
Okay, great. We're recording.
Great. So I'm going to pass it on over to our presenters. And presenting for us today, we have Sarah Perez-Sands and Pamela Mejia from Berkeley Media Studies Group. So go ahead and take it away.
Amazing. Great. So yeah, I am Sarah Perez-Sands. I use she, her, aya pronouns, and I am on the research team at Berkeley Media Studies Group. I'll pass it over to Pam real quick.
Hi there, everyone. Nice to be here. Nice to see you all. Nice to see folks from around the country. I am Pamela Mejia. I use she, her, aya pronouns. I'm head of research at Berkeley Media Studies Group, and I'm going to be talking with you. You're going to hear a lot from me today. So I'm also going to pass over to my colleague Kim Garcia, who's joining us as well.
Hi all, Kim Garcia here. I use she, they pronouns, and I'm a media researcher with Berkeley Media Studies Group. Back to Sarah.
Thanks. So today we're going to talk about strategic strategies for effective communication and messaging related to the prevention of domestic violence. Please feel free throughout the webinar to put questions in the chat. Kim is doing technical support for us today, so she might be able to answer them more immediately, or we'll address them as they come up, get to them at the end, or follow up after the call. And I want to shout out also, we have two amazing interpreters with us today. So thank you for being here. All right, let's get into it. So Berkeley Media Studies Group, we do a lot of things. Pam, Kim, and myself, we focus mainly on this first point here. We do research on news coverage of public health issues, and that really ranges across topics, everything from domestic violence to housing issues, to gun violence, soda taxes, et cetera, et cetera. Lots of stuff going on in public health these days. We also provide media training and strategic consultation for community groups and public health advocates, and professional education for journalists as well. So we heard that y'all just learned about how to post on social media in a previous webinar. So today is going to focus on how messaging can better convey the importance of prevention. So some objectives for today. We're going to summarize the layers of strategy and how they can shape our communication strategy. We'll identify challenges and opportunities to frame and reframe domestic violence as preventable. And we will describe how the components of an effective message can be used to develop prevention messages. So in this webinar, we'll be talking about making the case for specific system change policies, but these strategies can be adapted to communicating more broadly about prevention and why it matters, or really kind of whatever you're doing in your role.
And I just wanted to flag that we know that
yes.
people are coming to these conversations with lots of different levels of experience and background with prevention. So this is just a kind of a foundational conversation. We're excited for it to go into whatever direction people want it to, but these are just some foundational concepts. And we're also very excited to talk and think about ways that BMSG and the partnership itself can continue to be supportive after this discussion in messaging and communications work. So sorry there, I just wanted to.
Oh, all good. Jump in whenever. Okay, so here's a sort of vision that I'm sure a lot of you may see as a worthy goal to aim for, that California, or whatever state you're living in or working in, is free of domestic violence. So how are we going to go about getting there? Messaging and communications alone are not going to be it. These solutions alone will not do it. Each one of these solutions, each one of your approaches at your organizations is addressing a specific problem.
I was like waiting for my boss to get on the meeting, and then she didn't, so I thought I had time.
Folks, do we mind going on mute? I don't know, Melody, if we have a way to mute everyone all at once.
Yes, I can help take
Okay. Because we still have some folks joining. Okay, amazing. Thank you. So where was I? So everyone here on the call, like Pam said, has a different approach, and all of these approaches make up the pieces of a big complex puzzle, and messaging is just one part of that. So in order to reach this central vision, we need an overall strategy. It's really important to get grounded in an overall strategy because there are a lot of steps to take to get to this central driving vision. And so that is why strategic communication matters. So the way we communicate about domestic violence affects how audiences understand the problem and what to do about it. So generally, the emphasis in domestic violence work is on supporting survivors, which of course is critically important. But that means that prevention can get lost sometimes, gets lost in the mix. So we want to spend a little more time on proactive versus reactive communication strategies. We'll spend most of the time today talking about what goes into these an effective message about prevention of domestic violence. So we need to understand the strategic context. So at BMSG, our sort of motto mantra is that you can't be strategic and comprehensive at the same time. The message doesn't come first. We need to zoom out to get an idea of the overall strategy before we dig into the message strategy. And this is where the layers of strategy come in. Today, we're going to focus on that overall strategy and the message strategy mainly. But you can see media strategy and access strategy are also a part of the layers. And if you're curious in learning more about those, we're not going to cover them today, but you can learn more at our website. And Kim, I believe there are some links we can drop in the chat here, if you don't mind. Thank you. Okay, getting into it. So overall strategy has a couple of different components. You want to define the problem that you are going to address and clarify the policy solution for which you will advocate. And these two should be fairly closely tied and aligned, tied together and aligned with each other, so that it makes sense that you do this so that you solve this problem. I also want to highlight the difference between big P and little p policy. So folks on this call might be working on a range of different kinds of policies, and that could be sort of more on the organizational strategy or institutional policy space, or in sort of like the government arena, so local, state, federal policy. You could apply these strategies to really any arena, any sort of like level. You'll want to identify the target with the power to make the change, enlist allies who can help make your case, identify what actions you'll take to influence the target, and part of that is messaging. So remember, for each of these boxes that we saw on previous few slides, I'll just show you real quick. Each one of these has its own set of strategies. Everything will need its own pieces of the strategy. So getting into message strategy also has a few important components. The framing is how we talk about the issue, and we'll get into that first in a moment. The message is what we say and the format of the message. So y'all have been focusing on social media, so those would generally be shorter, more text-based statements. Then messenger, which is who says the message. You'll consider who are good messengers, who could be a good messenger and might need a little bit of help or training to get there. And then the target of the message. Who do we want to hear the message? And also keep in mind, what do we want them to do after they hear our message? So we'll start with framing. This helps us understand, this sort of groundwork helps us understand the background against which people form their opinions about domestic violence and how to prevent it. So frames are mental pathways that help people understand the world. There are no blank slates out there. People already have their own ideas and beliefs about domestic violence as a result of their personal experiences, cultural norms, and media narratives. So this is sort of like a train track. Folks don't need cues to follow their preconceived ideas about domestic violence. When they receive information, they can fill in the gaps based on the frames that they already have in their mind, those internal tracks. So one common frame, and a major one in the United States, is that of individual responsibility or rugged individualism. So the idea is that good things are because of good choices and bad things happen because of bad choices. So when this is the only frame and there's no other alternative presented, it's where people's minds tend to go first. And that really obscures the broader landscape of policy, environment, and other structural issues at the root of this problem, and really a lot of problems. So the challenge of framing is, how do we do it when we know that most people will slip into that personal responsibility mindset and aren't likely to consider that there are solutions, causes of problems rooted in something much bigger than personal choices? And that is the need to reframe. We need to shift weight from personal responsibility to institutional accountability. We want to get people, with our messages, we want to get people thinking about changes to communities or institutions that need to happen beyond the ways that you all are already directly supporting survivors. We need to show people that the world around them can play a big role in causing these problems and shaping behavior. And so when you start with an overall strategy, your messaging is going to be much stronger and clearer and more specific, because people have those frames. So Pam is going to now talk about the domestic violence framing that's already out there and the ones that we'd like to shift. So Pam, take it away.
Of course. Thanks, Sarah. Again, thank you all for being here and for kind of listening to, listening to us. And we also want to hear from you where possible. So Sarah gave a great overview of the layers of strategy, which again, just kind of an organizing principle. There's a lot more we could say about it, but the big takeaway I would say is that, messaging doesn't exist in a vacuum. Communications are all in service of something larger, or service of the larger goals that you're working towards. And now, again, we're really drilling in on that with that kind of framing and structuring in mind. We're now drilling in on the messaging, the what do you say, though you've decided on your targets, you've decided on the goals that you're seeking, you've decided what this communication is serving or is leading toward. So what are kind of some of the specifics of what you say, and what are some of the pitfalls? What are some of the places that can get really difficult, that can make communication difficult? So I'd love to ask this, and people are free to go off mute if they want, or put it in the chat. We've talked about frames. We talked about these assumptions that people have, the ways, the mental tracks that their brains jump, their brain trains, if you will. Sorry, that was a little corny, but I'm a little corny. That their brains jump onto. In general, but I'm curious to hear from this group of experts, really, what's been your experience of the frames people have about domestic violence? And I saw a little bit of this in the chat, people saying, oh, it doesn't happen here, or things like that, but I'm just curious to know from you all, and again, feel free to go off mute or put it in the chat, just any reactions or reflections you have on some of the frames that you encounter about domestic and intimate partner violence in your communities and your work. What are some of the things people believe about domestic violence? Some of the places they jump to. I'm going to give it a second. Anybody have any thoughts? Great. So this is a great point from the chat. To the frame is that domestic violence only affects female identified women, female identified people. I see here the female victim doesn't leave even though she can, because people don't know the complexity of leaving. Great point. So the why did the person stay frame, if you will. Other thoughts, other reactions. DV doesn't affect young people, right? So DV is an issue for the adults, if you will. I believe it doesn't affect them. They don't know people like that. It could never happen to them or anyone in their immediate circle, right? So DV is a problem of the other people. See, there's a belief that it rarely happens, or that DV is separate from gender oppression. A great point, and that ties into something I saw in the chat earlier, where somebody was talking about the difficulties of connecting DV to other kinds of social justice work as well, and to kind of our collective seeking of liberation. I would never do this, so what can I do to change others, right? So that separation of, this is just something that only bad people, that only a certain kind of bad person would do or be part of. The domestic violence is only physical. Great point. The idea that the invisibility of other kinds of abuse that on the spectrum that we all are cognizant of. Any other thoughts or things people want to share about their own experiences or their own thoughts? Well, y'all basically gave me y'all did the next slide for me, because we know all the anecdotal all the experiences that folks have had in their lives and their work are really borne out also by the research that Sarah, Kim, and myself and other narrative and media researchers do. Because what we can tell you kind of from a research standpoint is that all the frames and all the kind of the assumptions that people make about domestic violence are really borne out when we look at things like media about domestic violence, and we look at things like public and cultural narratives about domestic violence. So based on even our own work at BMSG, our own research on things like news coverage, we see, just like folks have said, first of all, domestic violence is framed as a private matter, right? That really only affects the family that's involved in that specific incident, right? So it's something that is about, other people. It happens to somebody else. It doesn't happen here. If it does happen, it's really about those people and the ways that they, and the problems that they're having in their lives. One way that shows up, for instance, in news coverage and in media narratives is that most stories about domestic violence focus only on specific incidences of domestic violence after they've happened and are on the criminal justice details of the case. And that kind of feeds into the second frame, right? That domestic violence, whatever else it is a criminal justice problem. It is a problem, it is an inevitable problem that needs to be dealt with after the fact through the criminal justice system. And we see that also lots of ways. Most stories about domestic violence, for example, are in the news only because of something happening in the criminal justice process. And police officers are among the most quoted people in news stories, for instance, about domestic violence, while folks like prevention advocates, family members, faith leaders, community members, those folks really aren't present at all, because again, domestic violence is very much framed as a criminal justice problem with a criminal justice solution. As folks said, domestic violence, stories about domestic violence, news and narratives about domestic violence tend to focus on isolated extreme acts of physical abuse after the fact. Again, so this kind of framing is very emphasizing the idea that domestic violence is whatever else it is, only an act of physical harm or abuse. Even when we say domestic violence, research has shown that people tend to gravitate immediately towards the idea of acts of physical harm. So things like emotional abuse, coercion, threats, economic abuse, etc., are largely absent from the conversation. And finally, we know that the problem that the framing is, and this I saw reflected a lot in the ways people were commenting in the chat, the idea that domestic violence doesn't happen here. Domestic violence is something that happens to those people over there, that it's not a community problem, so there's not a community solution. It's not about, that the only people who are qualified to deal with it are members of the police, for example. And that it's pretty much an inevitable problem that just occurs in some places and in some spaces. We see that manifest in lots of different ways. For instance, an analysis that we at BMSG did of news about domestic violence involving firearms found that overwhelmingly men and women who presented as people of color were shown as victims and as perpetrators and victims. Which create, pictures worth 1,000 words. So that can really create the idea or reinforce the idea that the only times that domestic violence is happening is perhaps in communities of color. So there's lots of different kind of frames that we're operating with when we're talking about domestic violence. It sounds like folks in this space are very familiar with them. The ideas of separation, the ideas of inevitability and futility, and the ideas that again, that this is a private matter, an issue of individual responsibility, people making bad choices or people making harmful choices, people choosing to stay in relationships, and that these problems are best dealt with through individual level solutions, like the criminal, after the fact, like criminal justice solutions. So that's the problem, right? But at BMSG, we always talk about, we got to shift from talking about the problem only to also thinking about solutions. So knowing that these are some of the harmful frames that are out there, what are some of the ways that in our communication, in the service of our overall strategy, in the service of these larger kinds of change we're trying to effect in the places that we are, what can we do? And how can we help break people out of the idea that prevention is impossible, that domestic violence is inevitable, that there's no role for preventionists and community action in addressing domestic violence? Well, let's dig in. Let's think about some options. So one thing I want to say, and this, if you take maybe nothing else away from this conversation, I hope there'll be many things, and I hope that won't hesitate to reach out to us at BMSG with questions and feedback and ways that we can support you in your work. But one of the big things that we really try to talk with folks about is the idea that a successful message does have three components, right? So it's the statement of the problem, the what's wrong, the solutions, the systems change solution, who should do what, what needs to happen to solve that problem. And then also critically, the values dimension, the why does it matter? What is it that makes this problem a problem and also this solution the right one? And the reason that I emphasize this and I kind of put everything on this slide and I really try to hone in on it is that unfortunately, what we know is that it's much easier to talk about one of these elements than it is about the other two. So what element do people feel like is probably the easiest to talk about, especially when it comes to domestic violence? Anybody? My daughter is always after me because I constantly prompt people with questions, but statement of the problem, there we go, thank you. It's so easy and so so it's so easy to talk about the problem because the problem is right there, it's in our faces, we're confronted with it every day, there's tons of data, and the problem is important. But it's also important that we include some of these other factors, the ones that are a little more difficult to talk about. So the values dimension, the why does it matter, and also the solution that we want to see. What we found in what research by other communication experts has shown is that people spend about 80% of the time talking about the problem, and only about 20% of the time talking about the solution on average. And so a good goal can sometimes be, we might not flip those numbers, but let's at least get our numbers a little more even. So we're talking about the solution at least as much as we're talking about what the problem is, which is one way that can help people overcome that idea of futility, that idea that there's nothing to be done about domestic violence, that this is just an intractable problem that is to be borne, not addressed. So one thing that we talk about a lot is I want to give some examples, right? And we have lots of examples here in this room, or in this Zoom room, I should say. The other thing I want to say about problems and solutions is that they need to match. And what that means is it's very, sometimes people have big statements of the problem and very concrete statements of the solution, and it can make it hard to see that this solution is the right solution to the problem that you're talking about. So what's an example? So I was in a training once, and somebody said that the solution that they were working on was enhancing training for school counselors to be able to recognize signs of intimate partner violence happening among teenagers in the district. I said, great, that is a fantastic solution. As a mom of a tween, I am really excited personally and professionally about the solution. What is the problem that how are you going to set up the problem that makes that solution the most logical next step? And the person said, and the person is a brilliant person, and we worked a lot on this, the person said, well, there's just too much violence in the media. Okay, that's also true. That's very true. But the problem is, if I say there's too much violence in the media, it's going to be much harder to make the case that the solution is school counselors in this district having more capacity around recognizing and intervening on intimate partner violence among teens. So instead, we then worked backward to, okay, so how can I set up a problem statement that makes the solution feel like a really logical one? And we were able to drill down into things like, what does violence look like in this community? What resources are available for mental health and health services in this school? And then setting up that as more of a problem statement with the solution that the person was seeking. Another example of that, kind of a modified version, is up on the screen. So one we have our problem statement. Many teens in the community are affected by domestic violence, and not all of them see healthy relationships modeled at home or in the world around them. That's why what they learn at school is so important. So again, this is also a problem statement that helps bring it to the social level, right? This isn't just about their, teens and their families and their their personal choices or their families' personal experiences. This is also about setting the context that school matters, and that the broader situation that surrounds kids is important and critical in shaping the relationships they have and the people that they are. So then the solution flows. This resolution, this is a hypothetical resolution, but one that is modeled on many I've seen, will ensure that schools have resources to provide prevention education and youth engagement around healthy relationships for every student. So again, this is a solution that flows really naturally from the problem statement. So one thing that we often tell people do, unfortunately, we can't do a full training today, but one thing that we'll often do in a training is we'll say, okay, what's your solution? And then let's work backward to a logical problem, to a problem that makes sense as the setup for why this is the important solution. This is the structure and this is a system approach we should take. I don't know if any folks have thoughts or reactions to that. I want to create a little space. I love to talk, but I also love to listen and have discussions. So are there any thoughts or reactions that are coming up for folks thinking about this, or anything people want to share about their own experiences with talking about problems and talking about solutions? Okay, well, you know what? I will take snaps. I will take snaps all day, every day, especially right now. It's a tough year for us all. It's a tough timeline. So I love that. So again, so that's one just quick. Oh yes, of course. And I do apologize. I know I'm a very fast talker, so I will try to rein myself in. I just get so excited about talking about this with folks. So one very good takeaway, I think, that can be helpful is just to, as you're thinking about structuring your messages, you're thinking about structuring your tweets, your posts, whatever else, is to be thinking, what is my solution? What do I want people to get to? And then how do I frame up the problem so that my solution seems like the best one, or the one that people should really engage in and get behind, or post about, or whatever else my overall strategy goal is. The next piece I want to talk a little bit about is the third bar, if you will, and that's the values piece. And this is a field of people who are doing this work for really, really important reasons. And I have yet to meet anybody in the domestic violence space who does not have passionate and powerful feelings about why they do this work. And so this is an easy piece in some ways, because this is just about making sure that passion, that reason, is infused in the things that we talk about. So what we know is that people make their decisions a lot of times based on their values, based on the things that they believe, based on the things that they find important. And the facts and the data, the problem pieces, those are less instrumental in shaping what decisions people make and the ways that they choose, to go forward in the world. And what we see sometimes, I think many folks on this call can probably attest that we see in our political spaces that there are speakers and politicians who provide a lot of data and a lot of facts. And there are speakers and politicians who are very good at at getting to the gut, at getting to the heart, at getting to those shared values. And those might not always be values that we ourselves identify with, but they're values that somebody identifies with. And it makes those speakers very powerful in ways that sometimes just throwing a lot of facts and data at people is not. And so that's why it's really critical that we think about making sure that whenever we're talking, whatever our messaging looks like, that we're putting forward some of the values, some reason why this matters, why this data point matters so much, why this solution is the right one, why this means something to you and to your audience. So I'd love to hear from anyone in the audience who wants to chime in in chat or out loud a little bit about what are some of the values that you try to evoke in your work, or that motivate the work that you do? And again, thank you again so much to our interpreters. And I really appreciate the reminders about slowing down. This is a good thing for me in my life anyway. But any thoughts people want to share about the values that ground them, or questions that they have? Because one experience that we have a lot is people say, well, which value should I pick? There's lots of reasons I do this work. So I'd love to hear just the things that people tend to prioritize or have found to be really impactful. Anybody want to share? No worries if not, but I'd like to ask. Values, any reasons you do this work? Intersectionality isn't additional work, it's at the core of our work. I love that. Intersection as a value, intersectionality as a value. Healing and justice, fantastic. Commitment to social change. There's a word that I understand to mean the idea of investing in, of making creating a better world for the next generation than the one that the previous generation had. And I love that kind of as a value and as a commitment. These are great and important values, and there's a lot of them. And so this is just a value statement that seems to kind of flow from the previous slide where we had talked about, oh, I love this. Every person has the human right to live healthy, stable, and rewarding lives free from violence. Fantastic. So not only so many values in that statement, not only our rights, but also ideas of health, stability, freedom. Oh, the importance of the voices of survivors, that the people most affected, most close to the problem are the ones who need to have the voice in the conversation. Words matter, absolutely. So this is a value statement you can see here that flows from the previous slide, that it is connected with that kind of example that we gave. And it shows a little bit, there's lots of different values we can choose to evoke, right? I often tell people, think a little bit about your problem and your solution, and sometimes the values that you want to center are going to flow from there. So for example, this example is about education and the role of adults in supporting children in the schools and the spaces that they are. And so that then affects the kind of values that we want to evoke when we're kind of tying this message together. As educators and parents, we all have a responsibility to equip every kid in this community with a strong foundation for healthy and safe relationships. Students will have trustworthy adults they can turn to. If I was talking about a different policy, if I was talking maybe about funding policy, for example, I might want to talk about financial stewardship and the value of investing well in what works. We know that prevention works. This is a problem we cannot arrest our way out of. We need to invest, we must invest wisely. There's different value statements that you can choose based on, again, the solution that you're aiming for, and also the audience. One thing I hear a lot about, I think this is a huge question in communication work. Well, how do I talk how do I talk with people who may, come from a different political background than myself, and who may be more concerned with kind of, finances, and maybe perhaps are in a more conservative space than I and my constituents are. Well, so to that, I think, okay, well, perhaps for some audiences, values around economic stewardship and financial stability and, and common sense are values that you may want to evoke. Whereas for other folks, perhaps more social justice oriented values are the ones you want to pick to lean towards. And again, the important thing is that the value is there, and that it's one that you believe in and that you feel confident in. And there's lots of different options to pick, but that value piece is just so critical. And yes, Lindsay, to your question in the chat, thank you. I'm glad. It's always nice to hear that we're saying something useful. We will be, I believe this presentation will be uploaded, and we're also happy to share a PDF of the slides. And we'll also be sharing our contact information at the end. So if you just have individualized kind of questions or things you want to bounce ideas off of, we're always here. Of course. We're excited. I'm hoping this is the first of many conversations we'll be having with some of y'all. So I want to say a little bit more about messaging, because so the three things that we just talked about, problem, solution, values, those are kind of that's the core, right? That's the, if you're baking a cake, sorry, I just got into baking during the pandemic, so forgive my metaphor. If you're baking a cake, this is the flour, egg, sugar, right? Flour, fat, sugar. Those are the basics of whatever you're talking about. But we also know that there's some kind of specific nuances, some specific frostings and garnishes that are really important when we're talking about domestic violence in particular, because of those frames people have, because of those beliefs, because of those trains of thought. And so there's a few, let's talk a little bit about these extra garnishes, if you will. A few of the things that can also really help make messages about this particular issue area especially impactful. So the first is an effective message needs to acknowledge negative feelings. Well, what does that mean a little bit? So if we move to the next slide. So I don't have to tell anyone on this call that this is a tough topic to talk about. People do not want to think about it. They want to believe it does not happen to them or the people that they love. They want to believe that this is a problem for other people that can be, that can just be dealt with by the police. They believe that this is a hard topic to talk about. And even within the field, this is a hard topic to talk about because many folks have been through this before. They have heard or been part of a campaign for a solution. They have heard, oh, this time our county is really investing in this, or this time our district is making a commitment to that. And they are burned out and they don't feel very optimistic or very open to the idea of another approach. And what we know, and we learned this through a 5-year research process, is that while we want to talk about solutions and we want to lift up the aspirational world we want to see, people don't believe us if we don't acknowledge first. Acknowledge, don't have to resolve it. But if we don't at least make a note of, make mention of, acknowledge that those bad feelings exist, whether it's the squick of I don't want to think about that, or whether it's the frustration and the burnout of, oh yeah, another year, another policy platform. So it's not necessary, as I say, to fully resolve that. You're not going to. But even just, we've found from our research that, and others' research as well, that even just acknowledging some of that difficulty and that tension, that icky feeling, can really help people keep from closing down and just saying, oh, this is some pie in the sky nonsense. This person isn't really, this group or this person is not connected to the world around me. This person doesn't know what I know, and why should I listen to them? Even just a few words that kind of help acknowledge the realities of how people feel about domestic violence and domestic violence prevention can be huge in keeping people's minds and hearts open to hearing the next thing you're going to say. So what does that mean in practice? Sometimes it can be something as simple as saying, this is it can be hard to think about kids in our community being hurt. I understand that. And what we're here to do today is talk about what we can do to ensure that children have a safe place to learn about relationships and safe adults to talk to when they're feeling hurt or scared. Or thinking about talking with colleagues and partners. Maybe the discomfort or the negative feeling we want to acknowledge is more about that burnout. I know we've talked about different policies before, and this is not the first time we've had this conversation. And but I want us to really, I'm sorry, I just got distracted thinking about what that could sound like. Apologies for talking fast. It might be something more along the lines of, I know we've been through different commitments like this before, and I want to assure you that I understand it can feel tempting to write this off as another fly-by-night idea. But I guarantee you, this is a commitment we are making and that we are investing in the long term. So again, these are not, you are not going to convince everybody. Everybody is not going to be all sunshine and rainbows necessarily after this, but even just those few words that can help acknowledge the reality of the discomfort play a huge role in helping people stay open to whatever you're going to say next about this issue in particular. All right, so what's another garnish? Again, now I'm making myself hungry. Well, one of the other frames that we know and that we talked a lot about earlier on is this idea that people don't think prevention is possible. They don't know what it looks like, and they very much doubt that, you know, it's something that can happen. And that's because, you know, prevention can mean a lot of different things. It's about the absence of something rather than the presence of something. It's really a challenging concept, especially when we're talking about domestic violence. And so one of the things that we've found, again, through this very extended research, is that when it comes to domestic violence and sexual violence as well, it's really helpful if people can see an example of success. What does that mean? Okay, well, we're never going to, well, I shouldn't say that. Success doesn't mean that this program or my organization or my coalition single-handedly ended domestic violence. That's not what we're talking about. Success can be incremental. Actually, it probably won't be dramatic. But if we can highlight small successes, incremental achievements in our messaging, that really makes people much more, again, open to the idea of, oh, well, maybe this is something that I could invest in, or this is something that makes sense for me, or that I should be part of, right? So let's think about that though, because it's tricky to think about success when we're talking about a problem as big and difficult as domestic and intimate partner violence. And so I'm going to move to the next slide, and we're going to ask you to go to visit a little Jamboard. There should be a link in the chat. And what we're going to ask people to do is click that link, and then if you can just add a note or as many notes as you'd like of examples of success, things that have been going well, right? Things that you maybe mention in a grant report, things that you are proud of when you talk with your family at dinner at night. These might be very small things. They might be an anecdote, a story, you know, one thing that worked a little bit better this time than it did last time. But those are all successes. And what we know is that elevating even those successes, as small as they may feel, in our messaging can be extremely powerful in helping people want to continue to listen, want to continue to engage and invest. So again, the Jamboard link is in the chat. And when you go to the file window, over to the left-hand side, you should be able to see a scroll bar, and Sarah's showing you where to click, and you can add a sticky note or as many as you'd like of things that are going well, things that have gone well, or that you're proud of, or that you want to lift up, no matter how small, because again, those are all successes that are meaningful to people when they're hearing about preventing domestic violence, as well as sexual harassment, abuse, and assault. This is true across these two issue areas. Other things, oh, I'm starting to see colors. I love it. I love it. And we'll also take a picture of this and send this out with the materials from the meeting. Because it can be helpful sometimes to look back and see the way other people are conceptualizing and framing success. It can help us see it in our own lives and our own work. Yes, my understanding is that the recording will also be shared. Melody, I don't know if you wanted to weigh in on that. I'm just seeing a question in the chat. Oh, perfect. Okay. Oh, wonderful. Okay. I'm very glad to hear that this is going to be saved. All of these resources will be saved. And again, these can be helpful things to come back to and look at when you're starting to think about, well, all right, Pam said to share success. What successes am I talking about? Again, we can think about all the things that we tell to funders, the things that we tell to the people around us that we love, that we're proud of, that make it worthwhile to get up in the morning and keep doing the work that we do. Because those are things that are impactful and important for an audience that is desperate to hear about success, that is desperate to hear that this scary, difficult problem can be addressed and is being addressed in the world around them. they're hungry for that. And so these things, no matter how small, are really important in the way that we communicate. All right, well, the Jamboard is going to stay up, so people can feel free to keep adding to it as long as they want and looking at it, or putting things in the chat if you'd like as well. As I said, we will make sure to share that resource, and I encourage folks to think about that, as an opportunity for your teams as well. Sometimes it can be just really nice to put up a bunch of Post-it notes and see some of the good stuff that's happening, and some of the things that we want to elevate in our communication work, because it helps us to recognize that we are seeing success, that we are seeing some of that incremental, essential change. Are there questions that are coming up for people? Any thoughts that they want to share about this? I know we switched technologies on you midway through the conversation, so I wanted to see if people had questions or reactions. Any thoughts about anything we've talked about so far? Is it possible to make the Jamboard bigger? We can.
I'll try to make things bigger. Yeah.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, that's always I just had my birthday, and I'm definitely learning that I need either better glasses or everything in the world around me just needs to get bigger, because I'm certainly struggling with my vision. So, all right, so let's talk about the third garnish, right? So we've talked about, oh, do you mind going back to the previous slide, Sarah, for just a second? We talked about our problem, we talked about our solution, we talked about our why it matters. We talked about our garnish of kind of giving some acknowledgement to those bad feelings people have, just to let them know that we're in the same place, we're coming from the same reality. We talked about the importance of showing that success, of just elevating one thing that's happened, that towards the positive, towards the end that we want to see, to help people break out of that sense of futility, that sense that there's nothing to be done about this problem. What's the third garnish? Well, the third garnish is really the most the third is the most connected to words, specific words, and that's about plain language. And this is a recommendation or an idea you may have heard in other contexts as well, but we just know it's really, really important talking about domestic violence in particular. So we have a lot of language that we use to talk about very complex concepts. Things like toxic masculinity, things like systemic oppression, just a whole host of different terms that we use. And those are great terms, and there are places that those are the right terms to use. But there are also times when more plain language, when language that more shows, not tells, is important. And I'm going to give a little bit of background on this. When we were doing the research on sexual violence on sexual and domestic violence, and kind of the communication needs people had, what we found is that some of the terms that are very commonly used in our fields of sexual and domestic violence and prevention work are very, very off-putting to some audiences, even audiences that are on our side, even audiences that really want to be where we are and do the things that we are doing. Some of these terms can really be off-putting and shut them down to hearing more, because they make people feel like they have to ascribe to a certain political belief, or that they have to have a certain level of education to be part of prevention, to be part of building the world that we want to see. But when we take those terms and we rephrase them using just more kind of plain language, those people are back with us. They say, oh, that makes perfect sense to me. Absolutely. Yeah, I can do that. I want to be part of that. So a classic example here that I was very much part of the testing on this was around toxic masculinity. This was a phrase that was being used a lot a few years ago, particularly. And what we found in message testing was that many people, male identified especially, but not only, really hated this term. And once they heard it, they were done. Whatever we said next, they weren't hearing it. Now, many of these folks were very much engaged in and anxious to be part of prevention work. and they wanted to build a different world and be part of a different world than the one they had grown up in. But that phrase, just those 2 words, were enough to completely end the conversation. But then we did some more work, and we discovered that when we talked about things like, it's harmful, it hurts everybody, that boys are taught, that people raised male in our society are taught that they have to be in control, that they can't show emotion. That's not a good thing for anybody. Many of those same people came right around and said, yeah, that actually is a really good point. Because if they can't show emotion, they can't ever ask for help. And that's a problem across the board. So again, this is just one example, and it sticks in my mind because, as you can probably imagine, the focus groups where we zeroed in on this got very heated. So it's one of those memories that just lives in my mind. Lots of back and forth. But there's lots of different examples of this. Now, that's not to say that there are some times when we need to use phrases, or we find ourselves best equipped to use phrases like toxic masculinity, like systemic oppression, like any number of other phrases, maybe in conversations with our peers, or at conferences, or with funders. That's okay. That's completely fine. It's just a question of thinking about your audience and understanding that we also know that the plain language, that brings in everybody. That creates a big umbrella under which a lot of people can see themselves. Whereas the more kind of insider language, that really is only appealing or meaningful for a very small community. So some of those folks that are your funders, that are your colleagues, that are your conference attendees, they may also be very comfortable with the more plain language. So I hope that makes some sense. In general, the takeaway I'd say here is, if you can use kind of plainer, more show, not tell language, do it. With the understanding that it's not always right, that there are times when that more insider language is appropriate, but that plain language is really going to work for everybody, including your insiders, and it's going to bring more people in with you and to the world and the work that you want to see and do. Questions about this? And one thing I want to give an example of, this is a lot, and I'm going to ask Kim to share a link in the chat to a resource that's on bmsg.org. And I apologize, Kim, I don't think I told you this, so sorry to make you scramble. It's on bmsg.org. It's called Where We're Going and Where We've Been. It summarizes a lot of the research that I'm talking about here. It's a big document. Don't feel you need to read all of it, but there is a section that actually breaks down some of these phrases that are really commonly used, and also offers some alternatives that might make it easier to show, not tell. And this is about a project that was focused mostly on sexual harassment, abuse, and assault, but many of the learnings transferred over to domestic violence itself. And again, my apologies for not having that pulled right up. But if you're especially interested in some of the plain language recommendations, they are on page 30. They start on page 36 of the resource that Kim just linked. And one thing to flag about this, I want to add, is that I know that sometimes showing, not telling uses more words, and that can be tricky when we're talking about, especially about something like social media. So I recognize that. I'm happy to think with folks together about ways to, as concisely as possible, use some of that plain language that brings more people into the conversation. But I do recognize that sometimes showing, not telling requires a lot more than just 2 or 3 words. And that can be a consideration to think about as part of your overall and messaging strategies. Right? Okay, any questions, thoughts, reactions people want to share? Okay, well, I promise we're nearly we're nearly at the end. I just want to say a little bit about messengers. We've talked a lot today about setting our overall strategy. Within that overall strategy, thinking about our messages, thinking about these kind of different components of values and problems, solutions, successes, negative feelings, and plain language that we want to think about as we're structuring the things we say about the work that we do. But I want to say a little bit too about messengers, because we know that messengers matter a lot. Not just what's said, but who says it has a huge bearing in every issue area, but especially in domestic violence and sexual harassment, abuse, and assault. So what I often ask people is, who's in your messenger mix? You know, we all got, there's two ways to think about messenger mix. One is, first of all, we know that audiences are most likely to believe in and connect with speakers that they identify with in some key way. And so that means a lot of different things. First of all, speakers from a range of different backgrounds are very important. And I know that that's a commitment that many folks have made, and I think that's an amazing thing. But I also want to say that within your speakers, your messengers, everybody has a lot of different identities, right? I have a lot of different identities. I'm a cis woman. I'm a Latina. I'm a mother. I'm work in public health. I'm the child of a single mom. There's all kinds. I'm a parent, although not a very good member of the parent-teacher organizations. It's another story for another time. But we all have a lot of identities. And so when we're thinking about who our messengers are, who the people are that are voicing the things that we want to say, or who are giving voice to the change we want to see, sometimes the identities that people can form relationships based on are not just about how we look, but about those kind of shared experiences. So what does that mean? Well, let's think about it this way. Some of the work that we did on messaging about domestic and sexual violence, what we found was that the most impactful messengers weren't always the messengers that looked just like their audience, although that helped. But sometimes it was somebody being able to say something like, you know, as a parent in this community, I feel that, right? So, or as a member of this staff, I know that. So again, one of the ways that thinking about your messenger mix can be helpful is, sure, it's great to have a diversity of people that can be out there answering calls from the media, posting, doing whatever else needs to be done from the communication standpoint. But it's also really valuable to have those messengers, whoever they are, be thinking about the things that they can say and do to connect with the audience, the shared experiences or identities that they can bring up that can help the audience see themselves in that person and see that person as somebody worth listening to, and somebody with a shared experience that they want to engage with. So again, if I was talking to the school board of my daughter's, the school board here in Oakland, where I live, I might speak more about, you know, as the parent of an Oakland Unified School District 6th grader. While by contrast, if I was in my neighborhood, I might say, you know, as a longtime resident of this neighborhood, or if I was talking with, you know, my husband is a school teacher, his district, I might say, you know, as a family in this community, as somebody whose partner is part of the fabric of this school. Or if I was talking with a community where my Latinx identity is most important, that might be what I want to lift up. So again, a diversity of speakers, a diversity of folks is important, but it's also really important that we think about the shared experiences and identities that can help us connect with our audience, and then making those identities visible so that audiences are more likely to listen to us, to believe us, and to want to go where we're going and be part of the work that we're doing. So I want to ask, what communities are you part of? And, you know, so we can use the Jamboard, or we can use the chat. I forgot that we had the Jamboard still. I got so excited. So Sarah, do you want to bring up the Jamboard again? I think there's another, excuse me, there we go. There's another slide that we can use, another one we can use in here. So please feel free to use those notes to think about, well, what communities are you part of? What are some of the identities that you hold that might make you an effective messenger with the communities you're working with? And then who else should be in the mix? You know, because maybe we know that sometimes it can be really helpful to hear from folks who are educators, who are in the faith community, who are LGBTQ identified, you know, so thinking a lot about who our different folks are, as well as who we are, and the ways that we can kind of combine all of that into what I call the messenger mix. Thoughts, questions? your ideas. And again, please feel free to use the Jamboard or the chat. We like the Jamboard because it looks pretty and we can then share the PDFs with you. So think about the communities you're part of, the identities that you hold that might be meaningful for audiences that you want to connect with, as well as other folks that you could connect with in your networks who might also be good speakers and messengers, teachers, youth, business owners, faith community members, academics, healthcare providers. I want to give people a little bit of time to think about that. Okay. Oh, I'm seeing some stuff connecting to the lived experiences of queer women. I love people addressing this middle question too of how do we leverage that role? How do we say out loud, you know, as a queer person or as a disability? I see disability community. I see secondary survivor. I see survivorship is a really important nuance. So I want to give people a little bit of space, and then we're gonna wrap up, and then we'll have space for questions and additional thoughts people have. Well, I'm going to let people, I realize also that it can be challenging and a little bit intimidating to put pieces of one's identity on a screen, especially with a group. So I'm going to ask that we go back to the slides so people can fill out the Jamboard at their discretion, or, you know, put things and you know, feel free to also, I recognize that sharing that can be an uncomfortable experience. So please feel free not to engage if that's not right for you. But we will have that board with the anonymous notes up there that we will send out as a PDF that people can kind of also look back to for ideas about how to not only build that community of diverse speakers, but also how to start thinking about the different identities that those speakers hold and how we can make that part of our communication work. Okay, well, we have talked about a lot today, and that's why I wanted to leave a lot of space for questions. So a couple of things that I want to say as overall takeaways. First of all, we know, as we talked a lot about, that the default frames about domestic violence can really focus on the individual. They can undermine or obscure prevention. But the good news is that there's a lot that we can do to shift those frames by doing things like evoking shared values, by talking about solutions at least as much as we talk about problems, by acknowledging the hard feelings that people have so that they see themselves and are more receptive, by illustrating success no matter how small, by using plain, clear language that people can understand and see themselves in and feel confident in using, by bringing forward diverse perspectives as messengers and making sure that as much as possible, we're connecting with our audiences on whatever shared note of identity. The other big point, I guess I would say, is that you cannot have a message strategy without an overall strategy. So all of these different messaging components that we've talked about all sit within that larger strategy piece that we've talked about, that is, you know, getting you towards the bigger picture goals of your organization, your coalitions, the work that you do. This is hard stuff. And I want to say that out loud too. Effective communication, just like everything else, takes a lot of time and a lot of practice. I've been doing this work for 12 years. I still learn something new every time I talk with anybody about anything. I'm learning things in this conversation, in this chat right now. So, you know, don't be discouraged if it takes some additional time. There's a lot more questions because we're here to help, and the partnership is also here to help. But I really want to you know, flag that BMSG has a lot of resources, but then we also have ourselves, Pam, Kim, and Sarah, and the rest of our team at BMSG, who are really excited to continue to connect with you all, to, you know, hopefully answer questions, to possibly work together, but even more so to just provide a listening ear and a sounding board, because we recognize that this is hard stuff, but it's worth it because the work that you all are doing is so incredibly important in the short and the long term, and we want to be supportive however we can. So thank you for being with us today. Thank you for the work that you're doing. As a mom and a parent and a survivor myself, I'm really appreciative of that, and I feel honored to be here. And I look forward to answering any questions that you might have, and to thinking more about how we can support you in the work that you're doing together. So with that, we have about 20 minutes. I want to leave space for questions and reactions. And then I also, we have some prompts on the screen if it's helpful to start thinking about some of these questions, or if you have other ideas or issues you'd like to raise. And there's my contact information on the screen. And we have some different ways to keep in touch with BMSG and to put into practice. Fantastic. Well, I'm glad that this is helpful. I hope that there were some valuable takeaways, and I'm very excited to see how people are able to put things into practice. Any other kind of questions, thoughts, reactions? I know it's always nice when a meeting ends early, so many folks probably are just ready to hop off, which I also completely understand. Thank you for hanging with us all this time.
I'll keep this brief, but I just wanted to thank you for this. This is a really great and informative presentation, and I can't wait to look more into some of the other resources that you shared. I'm the person that mentioned that we are having some challenges with communicating how our social justice prevention efforts connect directly to domestic violence. And I think thinking about this from that, think about the solution and then how can we reframe the problem to make that solution make more sense? As almost as simple as that seems, looking at it backwards, we have not done that. And I think that could be really helpful. And this whole thing has just been great. So I really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. That really made my whole day, no matter what. Well, I shouldn't say that. If I've learned anything, it's that all kinds of things can happen, but my day is just better for having heard that. I'm excited to hear that was helpful. Please don't hesitate to reach out to me at mejia@bmsg.org if it's ever helpful to have kind of a sounding board or another pair of eyes on doing some of that backward thinking. Okay. Well, I'm really glad to hear this was helpful. Again, all the recording, the slides will be made available, the Jamboards and the resources that we shared. And again, very much looking forward to continuing the conversation. I hope this is the beginning of the discussions we have, not the end. And again, thank you from the very bottom of my heart, not only for listening to us, for being such a great group, but also for doing the work that you do, which is more meaningful and important now than ever from all of us at BMSG. So I'll turn it back over to Melody and the folks at the partnership.
Thank you so much, Pamela and Sarah. Thank you for a great presentation. And thank you to Kim for all of your tech support. It was great to have that too. We have put a link to a brief evaluation in the chat. If folks wouldn't mind clicking on that link and taking just a couple of minutes to fill out that evaluation, that would really help us to get some feedback as to how this training worked out for you, and to get your feedback as to what would be some more topics that you would be interested in having us provide webinars on. So thank you so much to everybody for being here. This webinar was recorded, and so we will be sharing the recording in our resource library. And Pamela and Sarah also said that they would share the PowerPoint with us. And so we will also be sharing the PDF of that in that resource library. So we'll make sure that that's available to everyone. But otherwise, thank you so much for being here. And I want to say a big thank you to our ASL interpreters for being here with us. As always, it was great to have you. So if anybody has any questions, we will definitely stick around. But if that's all for you, then we hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thanks, Pamela. Thanks, Sarah. That was really wonderful.
You're very welcome. Sorry, I have to keep going on mute. My husband and daughter are installing shelves in the background, so it sounds like chaos